Navigating the dynamics of the Korean Peninsula requires more than just information. It demands insight. Korea Risk Group offers strategic consulting that cuts through the noise. Our experts provide in-depth analysis, risk assessments, and bespoke reports, all tailored to your specific needs. Whether you're exploring new opportunities or managing existing challenges, our insights can be your compass. To learn more about how we can help you make informed, strategic decisions, visit korearisk.com/solutions today. Hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to the NK News podcast. And today it is Tuesday, the 20th of February, 2024, and I'm joined here in the studio by my guest and fellow podcast host,
Yes.
Jeongmin Kim. Welcome.
Good to be here.
I've been listening to your Friday launches, your Friday releases of the Korea Pro podcast. Really enjoying your work. You and John are a fine team.
Glad to hear. We try to banter a lot in that one.
It's good banter, and I really, it was very useful. I had to listen twice recently to the rundown of the MMMP and the the MMA.
That was difficult. The election system in South Korea, which is very complicated.
Right, yeah. With the elections coming up just a couple of months away, if our listeners aren't sure yet, go back and listen to, I don't know what number episode it is, but it's a recent episode
Last
of
week's
the
one?
Korea Pro.
Last week.
The week before last. Okay, so those podcasts are a little bit shorter than mine. I tend to be a bit longer-winded. It's a lot of detail in a quarter of an hour. Very, very comprehensive. So keep it going there.
Thank you. Thank you for the shout-out.
All right, now we've got three things to talk about today. Jeongmin, you are the Kim Yo Jong Whisperer.
Yes, sir. It's my official nickname in this company.
That's wonderful. Who gave it to you?
I think it was Arius and Colin. Because there were this time, I think a year ago, when Kim Yo Jong started punching out statements day in and day out, and her Korean version cannot be translated enough into the Korean KCNA English version.
Right.
So what I did was I wrote stories based on my take on her Korean tones, which is very, very sassy and passive-aggressive.
Right, yeah, she does passive-aggressive quite well. So she made a statement last week, which very interesting about where this was reported, but we'll come back to that later on. So she's talking about a possible engagement between North Korea and Japan. Tell us more.
Well, Kim Yo Jong in the past few years, she started off with writing a lot of statements on Korea, first of all, but then she sort of moved into the U.S. relations jurisdiction, and now Japan as well. Maybe she is international badly worded statement sort of master there.
Right, because officially what's her title or her role?
No one knows officially, but people think that maybe she is OGD or PAD, the organizational or the propaganda department.
Okay.
But her real position is Kim Jong Un's sister.
Right, okay, which is a role of its own.
Right, and the Japan statement, basically the gist was it came a few weeks after Fumio Kishida, the Prime Minister of Japan, in the cabinet speech said that he is willing to pursue summit with Kim Jong Un in order to bring back the Japanese abductees in North Korea. And Kim Yo Jong was saying, well, I commend your, passion in trying to engage with us, and why not? Why not if you fix ABC? And those ABC was very tall order.
Now, this letter that she wrote, this statement, was not in the Rodong Shinmun, was it? Where was it published?
It was just KCNA, per usual, with some of the statements that might seem a bit awkward from the domestic reader's point of view.
Right. So it's really just for external consumption.
Right, and usually when it's not in Rodong and just KCNA, we tend to read it as not a set policy statement, but just like a trial ballooning sort of thing. And also she included a lot of personal caveat, like this is my own personal view. My brother, the leadership, has no idea about what's going on here, and
he doesn't know I'm writing
like
this
he
thing.
doesn't. He's not. Her point was he's just not that interested in you.
Right,
but I might be. That's why I'm writing as personal capacity.
Very, very interesting. Okay, now how close would you say we are now to the prospect of the very, very first North Korean-Japan summit in more than 20 years?
I would say almost not at all, because the conditions that Kim Yo Jong brought up were age-old stuff, like don't mess with our nuclear and missile development. Oh, sure.
Okay.
And then she was repeating the stance that the abductee issue has been already settled. there's no way Japan will go along with that, despite Kishida's really, really low, almost 16 to 25% approval rates.
Yeah.
He cannot go along with that because the main point of him mentioning this is for the abductee angle.
Right. And that's been the way, the line of Japanese policy for a long time. Now, if such a summit did go ahead, I imagine that for North Korea, one of the main pluses would be to potentially drive a wedge between Japan and South Korea, or Japan and the United States, or all three.
So the experts I've talked to unanimously said that rather than the sincere intention to engage with Japan and maybe pursue a summit, the core intention might be just just North Korea Playbook 101, which is driving the wedge between the three, like you mentioned, because last year the trilateral relations developed a lot, including the Camp David summit and all the drills and blah, 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 blah.
And summit diplomacy, etc. But Japan's Kishida, despite his low approval ratings, he's no fool. I mean, this is not anyone's first rodeo. We've all been here before. We've all seen this movie before. So surely no one is going into this with blinkered eyes.
Right. Probably. It's probably not going to happen. But I think North Korea may just sort of take turns and seeing who's a weak link between the two, and it's usually not the U.S. So they sort of alternate between maybe South Korea and Japan, usually South Korea, especially during the previous administration.
The Moon years,
Right. But now maybe they were like, why not try out Kishida.
Which I kind of had that feeling a little bit when they first sent that message of condolences to the people who died in
New Year's Day earthquake.
Right. And that was unusual for North Korea to say, hey, really sorry about the tragedy in your country. Forgive me, but it felt a little bit cynical.
It was interesting, but I was actually asked about this multiple times if it's an intention to improve relations. At the time, I said no, because it looked like the main intention was to show North Korea as a responsible, normal state, sort of. I think that was a priority. But maybe just partially trying to signal that, you are our next target of trying to improve relations and see where we go.
Let's keep an eye on that. I'm fascinated. Now, let's talk about... So, the Seoul government has decided that it'll be taking DNA samples from the corpses of deceased North Koreans who sometimes wash up on the shores of, or across the river from, or somehow end up on South Korean soil. North Korea lately hasn't been accepting these bodies back to its own territory for burial, and so the South Korean government said, well, before we cremate these bodies, we're going to take some DNA samples so that one day in the future, we may be able to get words back to their family that, well, your uncle, brother, cousin / father, whatever, was found dead here in South Korea. Sorry about that, but we got the DNA. Exactly.
And then maybe potentially funeral for the families for closure. It's ideal, but I rarely write about stories where there's a consensus that something is a good policy, and this was one.
Yeah.
Because although there's a very low possibility that there will be family reunion in any day in the future, close future, and also North Korea opening up the communication lines again, I think it's really low possibility. But still, every summer there are some sort of bodies that float downstream from inter-Korean river or coast or whatnot.
And for our listeners, that's because in the summer there's more rains, there's more flooding, there's a greater chance of somebody being swept away in a torrent of water and ending up on South Korean soil by accident.
Right, and there's a lot of downstream stuff at the border near the demilitarized zone. And then usually what happens is so it's a legal issue as well. First of all, DNA sample taking, it's very strict in South Korea under domestic law.
Oh.
So they do need a legal amendment for that's why they're doing this.
Okay.
Even when it's a dead body.
Right, because there has to be somebody giving permission normally, right?
Right.
And in this case, they're labeled as people with no family members.
Right.
So the government could say, well, we have to take DNA because they've got no family.
So that was a problem that South Korean government was trying to solve, because it's very insulting for North Korean, if they were North Koreans who are dead, to be cremated without knowledge of who they are, just marked as unaffiliated forever. That is quite sad, actually. So they wanted to give some justice to them. And secondly, a lot of North Korean bodies, when they float down, even when there are surefire signs that they're North Korean bodies from the police perspective, like the Kim Il-sung badges, or their clothes that they're wearing, or malnutrition, hats, and whatever, the bodies are usually very much rotten. and it's very difficult to tell who they are. And North Korean authorities definitely do not confirm if they're North Koreans these days. There were more in the past, but these days they don't. So
is that part of it, just the not talking to the South Korean government? Just one piece of that?
Yeah.
Okay.
And then because of that, the authorities here, even after a post-mortem investigation, it's difficult for them to mark them as North Korean residents legally.
Oh, I see.
So sometimes they are, like, reporters know that they're North Koreans, but they end up being nobodies.
Oh, dear. Okay. Well, and I learned through this article that there is a columbarium, which for our listeners who don't know is a place where ashes are stored, cremated remains, in Incheon City, where some of these people's remains are kept.
In Gangwon Province as well. There are two.
On two sides. Okay, east and west coast. Well, that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
But they are laid with all sorts of unaffiliated bodies.
Right.
Not marked who they are, really.
It's a sad story, but yeah, I mean, there's so many of them just due to the existence of a separated country where you can't talk to members of your family. So it's good that there'll be some DNA on record so that one day if somebody turns up and says, what happened to this person, that closure could be there.
And also interesting is that the Separated Families Department under the Unification Ministry is leading this, not defector department or anything, because they are amending and expanding an existing law or more like a government rule on DNA sampling the separated family members, so that they can check later on if the next generation can check who their cousins were and so on and so forth.
Yep. Wow. Okay. So third story. Now, this is a Korea Pro story that you did, but it definitely relates to North Korea. So we know that since 1960, North Korea and Cuba have had diplomatic relations with each other, and the two countries have an embassy. So Cuba has an embassy in Pyongyang, North Korea has an embassy in Havana, and last week, in fact, on Valentine's Day, a very unusual Valentine's Day for South Korea normalized relations with Cuba for the first time ever.
Established diplomatic ties.
Right.
And South Korea-Cuba relations soured really after the Cuban Revolution. And right after that, North Korean-Cuba relations improved. But I'm seeing a lot of reports that this was for a secret negotiation, so reporters also didn't know. So this was a surprise.
Right, and this was a long time coming, I understand.
Long time coming. It was 20 years in the making.
Whoa.
Multiple administrations failed, but they all tried because there's a very big trade potential with Cuba between South Korea and Cuba.
What's the trade draw?
The resources, really. The raw resources in Cuba. But also there are other trade needs. South Korea wants to diversify the supply chain, and Cuba is a very good target right now. But a lot of, first of all, South Korean government officials speaking anonymously framed it like, this is a win for the liberal democracy for winning over socialist countries or former socialist countries. And this will help us isolate North Korea further, blah, 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 blah.
Well,
I thought it was a bit...
Cuba's still technically socialist, right? It's far from being a liberal democracy.
And it's one of the closest friends that North Korea has.
Right.
And that embassy was one of the last to leave Pyongyang, really. And
oh, you mean during the COVID pandemic?
Yeah. So they're very, very close. And to frame this as a win for South Korea ideologically, I thought that was a little bit off. Too much ego, I think. But I do think that this could ruffle some feathers in North Korea. For Cuba, they're one of their best friends for being friends with their enemies, really.
and as I recall, the Cuban state-owned newspaper had a journalist in Pyongyang for a long time.
I didn't know about
COVID.
that.
So it'll be interesting to look up the Cuban newspaper. I forget the name of it, and find out what they've been saying about this.
It could be really awkward for them, right?
Right. But, I mean, there's so many countries now that have relations with both Koreas, and Cuba's just the last among many.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't think South Korea needs to read too much into this as a win, but it will help diversify trade supply chains. I think that's the most important thing.
Okay, and for Cuba, what's the draw? What can it get from Korea? Is it looking at construction contracts or automobile factory? Oh, I see.
Yeah. And there are also high-tech industries that South Korea is working on, so Cuba could, take advantage of that a little bit. But trade will come later. They will have to negotiate further, and that will be also difficult. But diplomatic ties that was 20 years in the making is very important. But I think maybe for Cuban diplomats, it could be a little bit difficult going forward to engage with North Korea, because North Korea has been doing this just in general terms. They have been cutting off relations or trying to distance themselves from anyone who's affiliated or friends with South Korea.
Well, I know that in the past, not sure if this still goes on, I know that in the past, some of the Cuban diplomats before being stationed in Pyongyang actually came to Seoul and did language studies here. And I don't know
Really?
I don't know how the Pyongyang government felt about that at the time.
Seoul말, speaking Seoul말.
Right, speaking Seoulmal with the girlish Seoul accent.
Oh, they would have needed re-education.
Re-education, yeah. So it's not it's certainly not the first time that Cubans,
right.
That Cuba has quote unquote betrayed North Korea in a way. But this is certainly a higher level. What has been the United States' response to this establishment of relations?
Very generic. They have the State Department said that Washington respects Seoul's decision to improve ties with Cuba, which is it's a respectful thing to say.
Yeah.
So there's not much
Washington
there.
has its own office in Cuba, doesn't it?
Yeah, although they have ongoing sanctions-related stuff or designations related to Cuba, the diplomatic relations, I think it's fine from Washington's point of view.
Right.
But the important factor that we have to keep an eye on would be Trump.
Yes, yeah, when he comes back in. If he comes back in, goodness me. That's not a foregone conclusion yet. Now, to those listeners who are frequenters of cigar bars in Seoul, that may be good news, maybe at some stage.
That's what John said immediately.
He went straight
news.
for cigars.
Yes.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much for coming on the show today, Jeongmin. Listeners, stay tuned because after this break, I've got a long interview with Martin Weiser about unification, leadership tracker on NK Pro, local elections in North Korea late last year, and the unification minister and what he was up to before he was unification minister. So stay tuned for that. And Jeongmin, we'll see you again in a few weeks, I hope.
Thanks. See you soon.
Bye. Join the Korea Pro community and unlock a world of exclusive insights on Korea. As a Korea Pro member, you gain access to articles, expert analyses, and comprehensive reports that keep you ahead on Korean affairs. Plus, enjoy priority invites to our unique events in Seoul that connect you with key leaders and influencers. Elevate your understanding of Korea. Join us today at koreapro.org/podcast. Hello and welcome back, and we have now a special guest on the show for the first time, Martin Weiser. Martin received his MA from Korea University in 2014. He has continued researching North Korea's political history as an independent researcher since then. His writings have appeared on Sino-NK, and in 2008 an article that he published on North Korea's legal system appeared in the European Journal of Korean Studies. Martin writes analysis pieces for NK News and NK Pro and also maintains the data tools like the missile tracker, etc. You can find him on Twitter at NK Researcher. Welcome on the show, Martin.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming. Martin, I thought we would start by talking about the statement that Kim Jong Un made on December 31st. We've talked about this with other people on the podcast, where he called for a new party line, one in which the DPRK is no longer interested in unification with the Republic of Korea. What do you make of this shift?
Yeah, so actually there was it yesterday, like the next statement at the North Korean parliament where he said, let's cut out all the unification references from the constitution, put in some more stuff, which basically is, deepening the division he's proclaimed, like in December.
Yeah.
And for me, it's very surprising this happened now. And there were not much hints on that before. But
when you say now, you mean now, not say 70 years ago when the Korean War ended, or now in the winter when there's not much going on? What do you mean by
actually,
that?
I mean in both ways. So we know apparently inter-Korean relations were not good for several years now.
Sure.
Like I think, what was it, in 2021, early 2021, they already said, if you don't change your policy like to the Moon administration, then we're going to take steps like abolishing this, what is it called, this Inter-Korean Committee for Peaceful Unification.
Right.
And then, of course, they could have done it a lot earlier, or at least be more open about it, or do it even later, because it doesn't seem to help him right now, except for like a military campaign to do this. So you could have waited, for example, for the next president and see if if anything's going to change, maybe give it another try. But now he just said, let's do it now and break off everything.
Yeah, it does sound all very dramatic, what he's been saying, talking about taking down the arch of the three great principles of unification and removing unification from the Constitution and changing the text of all songs that mention unification. I mean, it looks like it's pretty thoroughgoing. Is this a change in tactics or a change in overall strategy? What do you think?
So I can't really respond to that question because tactics and strategy is really a vague difference. To me, at least, because we know nothing about North Korea, it's really hard to figure out, is it just short term or is it really a fundamental change, at least to me.
Take the changes that we've mentioned already. Are these changes that you think can be easily reversed?
So in my opinion, of course, it can be easily reversed. Of course, if, for example, Kim would have to leave office for whatever reason, if he dies too early or, whatever happens, then other people can have different opinions about that because... So in the end, they are interested in unification. They think Koreans or like South Koreans basically belong into the Korean homeland of whatever the DPRK thinks it is right now. So they can still shift on it. They're always going to be anti-American, anti-conservative forces in South Korea, but they can just say, yeah, but we acknowledge you are similar to us. We still can go back to earlier.
But they're not saying that now.
Yes, but North Korea is saying... They usually have propaganda campaigns where they say really strong things and then they back out a little or keep it for later. So it's not, so you have to look beyond the rhetoric basically and say, so they have a military campaign, which of course they want to support by this harsh rhetoric of war and we are prepared to go to war and occupy basically South Korea. But it doesn't mean it's going to happen. It's like, so when you say, right now it's just rhetoric.
When you say there's a military campaign, I mean, are we talking about action against South Korea by the North Korean military?
So they threaten that.
Yes.
So that's a difference. They threaten that. And then, of course, you have very old generals which grew up under Kim Yo Jong and who believe in unification, basically. And they believe in protecting even South Koreans from military or like collateral damages. And Kim Jong, one of this campaign aim seems to be to do away with this humanitarian, basically holding back of civilian casualties to me, in a sense. So they just say, if we go to war, then there's not going to be any holding back or any sparing South Koreans, basically.
Okay, just so everybody's a legitimate target. Soldiers, civilians, it doesn't matter.
I didn't mean it like that, but it's just like, if you go to war against your own people, you're going to be go softer. So that's basically the point. And they say now that's now gone.
Okay.
If basically... In the North Korea, it's if Yoon says he can bomb the North Korean headquarters, whatever, then they're like, we're not going to spare your headquarters and any civilians involved, basically. They're not going to just bomb or kill thousands of civilians for no reason. But if war comes, of course, then there's going to be lots of people dying.
Do you think that the message in North Korea is still, the teaching in North Korea is still that we're all one people?
I don't know that. So apparently they canceled the inter-Korean agreements for them. They took away this Kim Yo Jong idea of, what is this, Samdae Honjang. I don't know the translation right now, but these principles.
Yes.
And then they have to build up something new, which Kim Jong Un might want to do. So to say we are completely different countries and we have to have really equal relations and nothing, no benefits for anyone without any equal treatment.
For Kim Jong Un, whose leadership is based on being descended from the Paektu bloodline, from his father Kim Jong-il, from his grandfather Kim Il-sung. Is this a risk to change the message in such a radical way and say that we're doing it very different from the past? We're going to go in a different, my way.
So actually, my expertise is not so much in speculating about what North Korea is doing, but what I see in South Korea is also young people, 30s, 40s. They are not that much interested in unification, so they just think it's expensive. We don't know these people anymore. They're too different. And of course, in North Korea, maybe people think the same. So there are, of course, lots of culture inflow, movies, dramas, music. But in the end, they don't really know the South Koreans. So this, what Kim Il Sung had and the older persons, so they knew there was a unified Korea before and they want this back. That idea basically is not so present, I guess, anymore. And Kim Jong-un might try to use this opportunity that there are not so many opponents to that idea, that he just wants to create basically a divided peninsula in reality for them, not with this unification, it's going to happen soon idea. Yeah.
Certainly in South Korea, the idea of peaceful coexistence is an increasingly popular one. Do you think that Kim Jong-un, has he shown any sign that he's comfortable with peaceful coexistence of two Koreas on the one peninsula?
Yeah, and that's again like, what is he going to make out of this phrase, like peaceful coexistence? Because he already said it's unification is basically done now. So we're two different countries. That's what you can read between the lines. And then, of course, he's going to be very interested in having peaceful relations instead of all-out war. And he said that we're not going to go to war if we are not attacked.
But he has used phrases like enemy state and warring states, and that I haven't. I haven't read all of his output in the last few weeks, but I don't recall him mentioning peaceful states or we live side by side in peace or things like that. I mean, the phrases that are used are enemy and warring, and that's...
Yes, but so we can also see the UN administration having a very similar approach. So they write into the Ministry of Defense White Book that North Korea is the principal enemy or main enemy. I don't know what the word is, but basically North Korea now wants to do the same and just put basically the rhetoric out. That's what our policy line is now, and that might actually change later.
So last week, over 10 days after Kim Jong Un's December 31st statement, North Korea took several of its main channels of messaging to the outside world down from the internet websites like Uri Minjokiri, Ryomyong, DPRK Today, and also some Twitter, Weibo, and Instagram accounts. What do you make of this? How does this reflect the new strategy?
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised because first I saw they took out basically unification news sections from websites, or basically those were not even fed with any new text, so for several months. But then suddenly also the websites disappear. So they could have done it in one go. And apparently they had some internal discussions or, basically wanted to have an agreement to back out of all these propaganda initiatives. Yeah, so I was hoping maybe everything is going to come back someday. But right now it looks like they, going to completely newly create social media campaigns or websites to maybe target only Koreans abroad, not on the Korean peninsula, or, all these friendship organizations they have that are basically very loyal to them. And then the propaganda is also going to be completely different, I assume. Not, for example, not talking about fake news about North Korea, but being more basically aligned with state propaganda that we already have access to.
Who were, in the previous websites and radio stations and other forms of media, who were they? Well, what were they trying? What was North Korea trying to achieve with its message? Who were they targeting, and what did they want to convince people?
That is, of course, very hard to understand what the actual aim is. But so they had did different things. So for one, they just did basically public relations campaigns. So just portray North Korea as a normal country where people have ice cream, go to, I don't know, like cinema or other, just have normal daily life. So that's one thing. But then they also, for example, attacked fake news when North Korea was had food crisis basically, I think 2 years ago. Then they responded to that by showing a supermarket stuffed with only domestic like snacks and goods. So they tried to challenge this narrative that North Koreans are basically starving. So they have basically these two things, doing just like some daily life, general entertainment, and then also trying to basically, challenge like narratives they don't like about North Korea.
And if you just said that they might be in a future iteration trying to target different people, maybe the Korean diaspora around the world rather than South Koreans, would that be with a similar intent, a similar message to, one, portray North Korea as a normal country, and two, to counter fake news about North Korea?
Yeah, that's a good question. How much thought they're going to put into this? Because what I could see from the videos I saw, they were really badly edited, so they had censorship in them. And usually we would, or like a normal PR person would just have reshot everything, so it really looks perfect. There's no hints of editing or censorship, but they either they run on a really short budget time or something, so it's really amateurish to a certain degree. Yeah. And if they now decide we're gonna do it more professional and more basically concentrated on just a few persons or channels, then maybe it's gonna be a lot better, like from the quality and also the narrative they push. So they might pick very specific questions out of it instead of just general, we heard fake news, we have food for everyone, and then you just see they basically don't have a lot of food. And it's just cheap domestic snacks or something.
You also mentioned the friendship groups that have been loyal to North Korea for a long time. That would imply that they would be putting out a lot of propaganda in non-Korean messaging. French, German, English, Arabic, Spanish, whatever the languages of their friendship groups are.
Yes, so there on the one side, there are these basically in Western countries or Africa, Latin America, friendship groups. And there are also, of course, these, like in China, Japan, they have these closely affiliated, like Chongnyeon in Japan, or these, I don't know if the Chinese one has a specific name, but just basically an organization for Koreans that identify more with North Korea in China. And those kind of might get completely different programs. So we saw that there's some Russian YouTube influencers basically from North Korea and Chinese speaking. So they might more focus on that, especially now that's basically what they perceive as a new Cold War. They're a lot more closer with China. Then maybe they're going to spend more effort on these channels instead of always having someone speaking English or basically responding to like Yonhap stories they might have read.
We've also seen lately in the last couple of days a disbandment or a dissolution or a radical reorganization of a bunch of North Korean bodies, such as the Committee for the Peaceful Unification of the Fatherland, the June 15th Committee in North Korea, the United Front Department of the Korean Workers' Party. So it's more than just taking down some websites. It looks like a big reorganization of the organs and institutions. Do you see that as significant?
Of course, it's significant, and I was a little bit shocked, because there was Kim Jong 100th birthday anniversary in, I think, June 6th. And then just a few days before, they took down the magazine of this June 15 committee in North Korea and all these unification sections. So that wasn't really a nice birthday present to celebrate this event. And when I looked at the website, actually, it looked like since about March or May last year already, they did not put any content up there anymore. So it looked to me like around that time when Kim Jong Un basically was showing himself on state media with plans to basically bomb South Korea with, I'm not sure if it was nuclear weapons at the time already, but so he already had these attack plans, and out of the same time, all these unification messages basically get silenced. So to me, it looked really like they already were working on that. And then it just was this December plenum where they said, okay, we are now going to make it official. And then basically that's when we all learned about it, but it was going on already months before.
Right. So with the dissolution of some of these government bodies and the changing in the messaging, once again, if you could summarize for us, how do you understand the new Roson or party line in North Korea?
Yeah, so the problem is there was no real unification rhetoric a lot, but not much exchange between North and South Korea. So in reality, little change for them. So they just abolished all these institutions, which of course might have pushed for more softer line on South Korea. But in the end, there is going to be no real change. And now they have to basically create a new terminology for this. How do they do relations between two different Korean states? Then it's not going to be the June 15th statement basically where they have to rely on, but some new, more equal, basically diplomatic relations. From there, it can develop in a good or bad way, so that's really hard to tell right now.
So it could maybe become a bit more like the relationship between the two Germanys before 1989, where they each have an office in each other's capital and have almost state-to-state relations, do you think?
Yeah, so like the reference to Germany might be a good one because they, even way before, basically from the beginning, they had a lot of exchange, they had a lot of agreements, legal obligations to each other. And just if you look at Berlin, that never was really their territory, but divided, and everyone could just visit from West Berlin to East Berlin and these things. But of course, on the Korean Peninsula, because I think Lee Jae-myung said that, Yoon Sung-yeol is saying it right now, or like the unification minister, relations have to be equal. And that's just like basically most countries try to establish their diplomatic relations, and then it's going to be and then it's the question, how do they put that into practice? Do they say, once you let your people watch our television, then we are going to let our people watch your television? So that approach, or is it going to be more forthcoming and say, okay, we're going to take this step and you please take that step soon? And then we can move on again, like in a step-in-step approach we saw in the past, or is it just going to freeze into basically two countries which pretend not to know each other?
You've just mentioned the watching each other's television, and that brings me to my next question. Do you want to say anything about the level of access to and censorship of North Korean materials here in South Korea?
Of course, as I have a lot of to say to that, because for 10 years now, I try to figure out how the South Koreans basically think about that censorship, because of course it's a problem for researchers who want to access that, for normal people who have to get a grasp what's going on with basically 30 million other Korean people. But so far they are really uptight. They don't explain why they have to censor completely innocent websites and these things. And because we talked about all these North Korean YouTube influencers, of course, people always say it's important that people don't get brainwashed basically by always reading North Korean newspapers, watching their television. But even if you watch these things, you get all the contradictions they deal with. For example, like I mentioned, the supermarket where you only have North Korean snacks and no imports basically, which confirms that they had some food problems. Then in other things, you have like this one young girl that pretended to be a Harry Potter fan.
Mm-hmm.
And then the funny thing was she was speaking perfect English, but the Harry Potter book she held into the camera was actually a Chinese translation.
Oh.
And I don't think many people notice because, of course, it has Harry Potter in English on it, but in the, I think, top right corner, you can see the Chinese characters.
Ah.
And so because I saw that Harry Potter cover when I was in China like 10 years ago, I recognized it. But of course, there is some issue there because she's probably not trilingual in Chinese English, perfect speaker. So maybe they just thought, oh, China is close by. We just order one, basically get it across the border and then pretend she's a Harry Potter fan. So you can see all these contradictions that don't make sense if you really watch the propaganda.
So would you, as a researcher, would you recommend that there be more access to North Korean propaganda materials here in South Korea? Well, actually, even not as a researcher. Do you think that South Korean citizens should be allowed to watch North Korean TV if they want to, or read a North Korean website or newspaper? Just like, again, the German comparison, just like happened in West Germany, right? It was always possible to buy East German newspapers and magazines in the West.
Yeah, so I don't know really about the West German example, but in principle, it was all possible. You could even go to East Germany and go to the library and bring everything you could buy.
Yeah.
But one thing, so because I'm a scientist, so I try to be very precise. Basically everyone in South Korea can watch South Korean television. So the only thing is, so they have to go to the Ministry of Unification library, then of course register. So you have to be a certain age, I think 16 to do that, or 14. And then you have to wait two weeks until the TV material is supplied to them.
Right.
Then you can watch it. Maybe not the best quality HD. Other people get via satellite, but so you can watch it. But who's gonna do that?
Yeah.
Who's gonna take from if you're living on Tokyo, it's impossible. If you live somewhere a few hours away, it's impossible. So
there's only one
basically
location.
No one can watch it except people living in Seoul.
Yeah.
So it's basically, it's not completely censored, but nobody can access it in reality. So it's just a very strange way to keep material from accessing.
Okay, let's move on to our second topic. One of the things that you do here at NK News and NK Pro is you keep the leadership tracker up to date. So I want to talk a bit about that. You're in charge of data integrity at the leadership tracker. And that's a tool for, well, everyone who already subscribes to NK Pro will know, but that's a tool that you can use to keep an eye on who's doing what. So can you tell us how the leadership tracker works?
Yeah, so in its core, it's basically trying to track every appearance of Kim Jong Un that is announced in state media, like a real event. So, of course, sometimes they, for example, show like these red, basically placards that they put on buildings, and we don't include those. If they say, for example, Kim Jong Un visited a supermarket 3 times, then we're not going to put this into the tracker. But if it's basically like a front news story where they say Kim Jong Un visited this munitions factory or like gave this news speech at parliament or somewhere else, then we're going to include this in the tracker and also all the other people that show up in the same news report.
So you're talking about news reports, so obviously you use the Rodong Shinmun. What other sources do you use to update it?
So the good thing about Kim Jong-un reports is they show up in every media, so it does not make a difference if we would cover like all of them, which we of course do.
Yeah.
But it's always the same news story, KCNA, Rodong Shinmun, all the other outlets. And then, so one thing we do with this tracker is that we not just include all the persons that show up, also like the titles they are mentioned with. So sometimes there's no title, but it's usually like, is it a Deputy Department Director for Kim Yo Jong or basically a Minister of Defense or these things, which is of course important to keep track of any changes that might happen.
Yes.
We also list like the rank of people, the sequence in which they are mentioned. So that way we also can figure out, okay, did, for example, some person drop to the end of the list?
Yeah.
Or did Kim Yo Jong basically get higher standing because she shows up like second out of a sudden instead of seventh? These kind of things.
And that's often especially visible in very formal events like a funeral of somebody or a a visit to the Kim Il Sung mausoleum, right? That there's a very clear order in which people walk or stand.
So one thing is that they really write this in the text, which often does not happen. So they only mention, for example, like the Politburo Presidium members, like 4 or 5 people below Kim Jong Un. And then, of course, you have the whole Politburo. Sometimes it's mentioned if the parliament convenes or some other important events. But like that's another of my jobs, to try to track the ranking of people that are not mentioned. So if I, for example, look at a picture of these Kim Il-sung mausoleum visits, then you also can figure out who's basically moving to another position or who was expelled from the Politburo. That's subtle details you can figure out if you basically know how to decode all this ranking protocol they have.
So have you become quite good at recognizing faces of unnamed North Korean people?
Not of unnamed North Korean people, of course, but like most of the top persons, maybe is it like 40, 50, like the ministers, and those I tend to recognize, even if it's just like the back of the head or a side.
And so this is trying to understand the upper echelons of North Korea's leadership through appearances. It's kind of what they used to call Kremlinology in the Soviet era.
Yeah, basically the same approach. Yeah.
Right. So in the last year or two, can you tell us what are the 3 biggest leadership developments that you've noticed and why they matter in understanding North Korea's leadership?
The 3 biggest that's of course a hard question, but so there's this big question mark of this, what they call a first secretary of the Central Committee. Mm-hmm. So we didn't even know about it until the party regulations got leaked, I think, in summer 2021.
Yeah. You mean we didn't know about the existence of the position?
Exactly, yeah. Okay. Because so they had a party congress in January 2021. Yeah. And then they talked a little bit about the regulation changes, but they never referenced this first secretary position. So apparently it had to have a purpose, and then of course speculation was maybe Kim Jong Un is ill, or he wants to prepare for orderly succession. Yeah, whoever might take that, and then the question is if they already keep it a secret, maybe they also don't want to announce a person that was given this position. Yes. Then I tried to figure out maybe the ranking tells us something about who might take this position. Because if it's the first secretary, so he's the person directly below Kim Jong Un, and that always should be the number 2 in all situations. Yeah. And
so do we know who that is now?
And of course we don't know. Then I would have written an analysis about that, or many other people would know as well. But we saw some really strange changes. So for example, so I had to look that up, and several months ago or 2 years, there was this very senior guy called Chong Sang-hak, or Chong Sang-hak. I might confuse that name right now. And suddenly in Nodong Shimun article on the front page, he was listed first before, for example, Cho Young-won, who is considered like the right hand of Kim Jong Un. Yeah. And then that was very strange. So if he got promoted to the top, that should mean he was put on the Politburo Presidium or got this first secretary job. Yeah. And then suddenly the state media retracted this report and then put him into, basically they split up the group, said Cho Young-won accompanied Kim Jong Un, so he just arrived there with him, and the other officials all basically welcomed him when he arrived. And then the problem is the ranking information thereby is gone. So it might still be the case, but they just try to obfuscate it, basically to hide it between these, basically splitting those 2 persons in 2 sentences, and then you can't tell basically who's at which position.
And one other leadership change that you've noticed recently.
So actually, I'm not finished. So that story kept popping up. So because there might be other changes, and the one thing that happened is Kim Do-kun, the premier or prime minister of North Korea, he also suddenly switched positions and became the number 2. And that's, for me, that's like the most reliable sign that something happened to him, that maybe he got this position to be, at least in the party sense, the official successor to Kim Jong Un if anything happens. And that was also very confusing because North Korean state media also did not acknowledge it. But only a few months after he showed up in pictures at the front, suddenly his name and Cho Dong-hae switched positions, and then it was at least clear for me something happened internally that must have caused this.
So that name again is Kim Do-kun, is it?
Yes.
Okay, so he's someone to watch.
And that's the interesting point. He was severely criticized by Kim Jong Un recently, a few months ago, and nothing happened to him. So that's a very surprising event.
Right. Now, in the last year and a few months, the daughter of Kim Jong Un has been seen in many photographs and has been given a title, but not a name. We still don't have a name published in North Korean media. How do you see her role or her future role? Is she being prepared for a role?
Yeah, so I can't really predict what's going to happen to her, but I see what media is doing. So they really tie her to the missile and satellite program. And so I wrote this one analysis a few weeks ago, or like maybe even days.
Yeah.
But you basically can see that the way North Korean state media is talking about her or like referencing her or just ignoring her, even if she shows up in pictures, is really linked somehow to the satellite program. So we had it in the beginning, and then apparently when she showed up, it was like the Hwasong 17 test for the first time.
Yeah.
And then she visited the Satellite Institute and these preparations. And then suddenly there were no more references to her. And that happened shortly after the first satellite launch failed. And then you had another one, and suddenly she appeared again in media, was referenced again. Then we had the successful launch, I think, in November, the third one.
Yeah.
Then suddenly, a few weeks later, of course, she got her own sentence in state media, which is usually that's something that happened, for example, to Kim Jong Un, like a sign of a successor or really a politically important person.
Yeah.
They want to differentiate from other officials. So it really looks like they're like, okay, she's going to have to have a politically important position in the future, and we have to acknowledge this now. And that also fits with that they don't release her name yet, because North Korean state media really is very strict about how to present basically the name of the leader and the successor. So it has to be in a bold font and some honorific titles, like, of course, Tongji, like comrades, but then before also like beloved, respected, something like that. So we already have this in state media, but without the name. So it's, I think, Chajebun or something, just meaning daughter. But basically, they're not at this stage yet where they say, okay, we can reveal her name, put her in bold, and then maybe they try to skip this part or keep it for later.
It's interesting, isn't it, the sort of sanctity that they give to names. I recall similarly before Kim Jong Un had his coming out party in September or October 2010 that I think everybody in North Korea knew about him, but they weren't using his name yet in the media and weren't talking about him to foreigners.
I'm not sure what kind of term they used, but it was like Changunim or Odin Changunim, something like
the young general or the youthful general,
yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. Okay, so that's something to watch as the daughter of Kim Jong Un continues to grow, to see what role or what title she may get. How old, do you remember, roughly speaking, how old Kim Jong-il was when he first got some kind of party title or party job? Was he already an adult? I imagine he was already an adult by then, right?
I don't memorize all the short biographies on the website, but I think it was when he was like 20, 22, something. So he, of course, joined the party, and then he had some lower responsibilities, and then probably with 32 or something, he was fully engaged in party work. Yeah.
Okay, so she's certainly got some time left, depending on the health and the longevity of her father. Okay, so let's move on to our third topic that I want to talk about with you today. This one is about local elections in North Korea. In November last year, North Korea held local elections after election law reforms were made at the party plenary last June. How were the November 26 local elections similar and different from North Korean elections in the past?
Maybe there was one big difference, and so they allowed they acknowledged votes against the candidates. That is something they didn't do since the early 1960s. So basically, they always say 100% of people participated and 100% voted in favor of candidates. And for that, you have to know, basically, people only have, they only get one candidate they can vote for in the real election. And then they can either put their basically ballot into a box or just cross out the name with a very random looking pencil, at least in the videos we have access to. And of course, there is no incentive to do that. So, of course, there's always going to be very few people that try to protest, but at least now they acknowledged, I think, a really low percentage, like 0.9% or something. And that's interesting because of two reasons. For one, that they say, okay, we're going to acknowledge a position against the people we put forward. And the second one is that even because they released different results for provincial and local, or like city, county deputies, that the provincial deputies had a much higher, or not that much higher, but a higher support rate basically. But on the local level, that people were less satisfied basically. They didn't want those candidates to a certain degree. It's just like a few thousand people, maybe 10,000 people that voted against candidates. But you can see, okay, the closer they are with the people, basically, the more likely they are to vote against him or say we wanted a different one that we knew. Because one other change that at least we know about now is that they had these two-way competitions before elections. Basically, like a few hundred voters basically gather, and then they have recommended persons.
Yeah.
So that's how they call. They recommend someone to be deputy, and then this voting council, small voting council, has to decide which to choose. And then, of course, if you debate who's a better person, then there are going to be more people who say, yeah, actually the other one is better in my opinion. Then you get these higher opposition rates, basically, to candidates.
So looking at the big picture of North Korea, what can we learn overall about the change in local election law and how they were run?
Yeah, one thing that's really fascinating is that these basically more competitive elections, even if it's not much choice for voters, they don't came out of nothing. So we, for example, Asia Press interviewed one North Korean who said since I think 2022 they had these very competitive elections on their workplaces or other units where they had 2 or 3 candidates standing up for post, and then people really could freely vote who basically should head the unit or take some other responsibility. So they already had these kind of trial elections on their workplace, which they put then on the national scale.
Mm-hmm.
And also, one thing was that Kim Jong Un suddenly talked about intra-party democracy.
Within the Korean Workers' Party.
Yeah, that's of course in his own party when he visited, I think, the party school last year. And that's also that it's very interesting because at least in communist philosophy, they are very about control and all these things, but they also always emphasize, the people have to really support it. You have to do some voting, some opinion collection. And then, of course, in the party, you also have to debate policies and then put them up to a vote.
Yeah.
And that also aligns with suddenly the parliament having these deliberation sessions, the party central committee meetings also. So there is something going on apparently for 1 or 2 years. And now suddenly they took this big step to also change the election law, have very different elections to like the past basically 50, 60 years.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Of course, the first word in the formal name of North Korea is democratic. So North Korea is trying to be more democratic at the local level. And we'll see what that results in the future. We may come back and talk about that in a future time. Our last topic I want to talk about today is it's also unification related. We started this interview talking about North Korea's new Roson or line on unification. So let's now talk about the man who is in charge of implementing South Korea's line on unification. And last year you analyzed over 5,400 YouTube videos uploaded by Kim Yong-ho, the man who is now the unification minister under President Yoon Suk-yeol. His channel, Professor Kim Yong-ho Reads the World, was deleted in June last year, but you were able to find archives of these videos on something called Playboard. So, Martin, tell us the big picture of what you learned from these 5,400 videos.
So maybe first I have to wager that I did not have access to all the videos. So it's basically it just collects metadata like length of the video, how many people watched it, and of course titles and these kind of things. But like the actual footage is lost for most of the things he deleted. So I can't really say anything about what he said in most of these videos. For example, how he talked about prison camps, which is one title of the videos in North Korea, or these kind of things.
Okay, so it's more accurate to say that you analyzed the titles and the metadata of 5,400 videos.
Yes.
Okay, that's certainly a lot less time than watching 5,400.
Yeah, so
I was wrong on that one. Okay.
I added up all the time of the videos. It's like 2,000 hours. So like even when he was nominated for minister, then like all the lawmakers should check all the materials. That would have been impossible if he had not deleted it. Yeah.
Gee. Okay, so tell us from the titles and the metadata, what are some of the favorite topics that he talked about?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, he, first of all, his like university page does not strike you like a North Korea expert. And then the only experience in North Korean things basically he has was, I think, 1 or a little bit longer under the Lee Myung-bak administration as presidential secretary for unification.
Mm-hmm.
And then mostly is about U.S. policy, like these like big power competition, these kind of political science issues.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also visible in his YouTube videos. At least if you look at the titles, it's always U.S. policy or U.S. policy towards North Korea. And the actual North Korean things that are only about North Korea is really a smaller part of all these videos. And so you have to imagine he did this for, I think, 5 years. And then like it really grew a lot, but he spent hours every day on these videos. And then to see that North Korea features so little in this, and then suddenly he becomes a minister on basically North Korean issues is a little bit surprising.
So looking at the metadata and the titles of these 5,400 videos, what do you think could have been predicted about his performance as unification minister or his stance as unification minister before he took up that position?
Yeah, so one thing was that he invited Ko Young-won, his special advisor.
Right, the former diplomat from North Korea, French-speaking diplomat.
Yeah. And so he was on the channel like 10 or 15 times. So and he was the only guest that was featured so often. So you already could see they have a special relationship. So it was not surprising that he took him as his special advisor.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one thing.
And as a prominent North Korean defector, one imagines that he probably doesn't have a very positive view of North Korea or relations with North Korea.
Yeah, and that's one thing you can see from all those videos. He's not very like the minister is not interested in reconciliation. So he's, for example, inviting the defector, always trying to talk about speculation theories. Did Kim Jong Un die? He did that very early, even when the Delhi NK report was not out yet. So because there were some people who said, okay, if Kim Jong Un is not showing up at the Kim Il-sung mausoleum visit in April 15 in 2020, then something must have happened. Like seriously, he must be seriously ill, or like even like all these death conspiracies. And he just jumped on this issue and made several videos. And then you can see all the time he's more interested in speculation. Why is China bad? Why does the US have to be harder against those states and everything?
Yeah.
But he's not so academic, basically, in the question, what is North Korea? What's going on there? That's not on his mind, basically.
And so he's been unification minister now for what, about 6 months, I guess?
Yeah.
So how do you see his performance as unification minister?
Yeah, so it's really hard to judge someone after 6 months, but what we can see is that he's really focusing on North Korean human rights violations, like giving out lots of money to NGOs, to initiatives. Also, he's campaigning for this North Korean human rights archive, museum, or library, which seems to be like his main agenda point these days. And you also can see this in this media outreach on YouTube. The Unification Ministry is released a new series where they basically interview North Koreans, and then they only talk about their grievances, their hardships, the human rights violations they had to endure. And then so it's this very narrow focus on human rights violations, which of course is important. And he also has to oversee the writing of this new human rights report that is supposed to be released every month, so maybe in April or March. But the problem is you also have to understand what's going on. So, for example, if they have these new election styles in North Korea, then you have to analyze what's going on. Where did that come from? Where might it lead? But the Ministry of Unification is really not talking about this a lot. So they gave a press conference where they took, I think, a pre-prepared question. And then that was it. They just said, North Korea is not a democracy. Let's not talk about anything else. That's for me is a big problem because you have to look at it in a complex way, not just say human rights violations are the main topic. You have to look at on the whole spectrum and say, okay, there are lots of human rights violations. How can we get them to basically violate less human rights? How can we help people that are starving? How can we help people in prison? And there have to be lots of strategies, and not just we're going to basically criticize you until you either collapse or back down or basically stop listening in the end.
Is that how you would summarize South Korea's current policy on unification and inter-Korean relations, is simply criticizing North Korea?
So maybe I'm missing some important pieces, but that's what I see from all the media events, from their conferences. That's the only thing they seem to acknowledge right now.
Okay, so having now looked at the unification lines of both Koreas, North and South, I'm going to ask you to speculate a little bit. What can we anticipate this year from inter-Korean relations?
Yeah, that's another big question. Of course, if we already can see that there are going to be lots of military tensions, and maybe that's going to escalate into real live fire, and maybe even people dying on like these border islands or in other areas. So that's not we can't really be optimistic about that. But so how I try to explain, Kim Jong Un is trying to basically build a new concept of how the both Korean states should have relations, and maybe there's going to be something new coming out of this, especially because so Yoon Suk-yeol is not going to back down from denuclearization, but they also have to establish some kind of contact, or at least have some agreement. Okay, where can we cooperate and where not. And that might actually happen over this year. So maybe that's going to be a more optimistic thing to watch out for.
Okay. I mean, you, of course, you've lived here in South Korea for many years. You live here now with a family. You're not planning to leave, so you're not too pessimistic, are you?
Yeah, I'm not afraid there's going to be war. I'm not going to afraid they are going to bomb the Songnam Air Base, which is very close to where I live. So that's not on my mind. But so I can see the Yoon administration was very brave for South Korean context to ask for the end of censorship of North Korean media, and nothing happened. So to me, that's a very disappointing development, especially since they proclaimed it before Yoon got elected, then tried to work on it and then backed out. And in the end, if North Korean studies gets harder and harder to do here, then in the end, I have to move somewhere else.
But I have to say that that's not the first time that a South Korean government has promised that citizens of South Korea would have access to North Korean media. I remember when Kim Jong Un was president more than 20 years ago, that there was an announcement then that people would be able to even receive satellite television from North Korea and look at North Korean media. And that didn't happen then either. And it hasn't happened now, even though, as you said, President Yoon's government announced that it would. And it seems that it always comes back to this inertia around the 1949 National Security Act that forbids any material that praises the leadership of North Korea. That no government, no president, and no National Assembly wants to take the political risk and spend the political capital to get rid of that law.
So I went to a few meetings where that was referenced, this Kim Jong initiative to allow satellite, basically receivers for North Korean television.
Yes.
And maybe I got the details wrong, but they said it's legal. It requires a very expensive satellite dish. So I'm not sure about how NK News is doing it, but you didn't have to apply for an exception. So I assume it's okay. Of course, the problem is the security organs going to monitor you, maybe, especially if you're a progressive activist. They're going to blame you for basically facilitating North Korean propaganda. But as far as I understand, it is legal to watch satellite television, which you also can do mostly on YouTube. But yeah.
Okay, so that one only. All right, but not the other.
But you can't. So all websites basically are blocked. You can't, or you might share North Korean newspapers with your friends, but in the end, they can charge you for doing something criminal.
Yeah. So to come back to what I was asking earlier, so if you do end up leaving Korea, it's not because you're afraid of war, but because it's hard to do North Korean studies from in South Korea.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Martin Weiser, for coming on the NK News podcast today. People can keep up with your most recent work at NK News and NK Pro, and they can follow you on Twitter at NK Researcher. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Dive deep into the heart of South Korea's most pressing stories with the weekly Korea Pro podcast. Hosted by Jeongmin Kim and John Lee, this weekly 15-minute podcast is your source for thorough analysis on all things ROK. From intricate politics to dynamic cultural shifts, we cover it all. Tune in every Friday on koreapro.org, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Korea Pro Podcast, insight, not just information. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our podcast episode for today. Our thanks go to Brian Betts and Alana Hill for facilitating this episode, and to our post-recording producer genius Gabby Magnuson, who cuts out all the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, and fixes the audio levels. Thank you, and listen again next time.